If you ask certain people, why do science and religion not mix? Why are they not reconcilable? They'll often not reach for an idea, they'll reach for a name, for a person, and that person is Galileo. Now, we've all inherited the story of Galileo over hundreds and hundreds of years about this martyr of reason and science and faith who looked through the telescope that he invented and discovered the truth and was executed for it. However, what if I told you that that entire story is pretty much not true? And indeed, more than that, the way that Galileo actually practiced his scientific endeavour, or natural philosophy as it was at the time, has actually caught us in a trap that haunts us to this very day. Okay, just to get a few facts straight, there was a trial in 1633 and he was suspected and warned about potential heresy by the Inquisition a couple of times. But that's about as far as the story that we commonly understand about Galileo begins and ends. The reason he ended his life in the way that he did is not because it was reason versus faith or dogma versus science. It was actually about personal pettiness and political issues. So in 1623, Urban VIII was elected the new pope. And the thing about Urban was he was a great mate of Galileo. In fact, he was a patron. He'd funded a lot of Galileo's work and had actually written poems about how wonderful Galileo was. They were friends. They mixed in the same circles. They discussed theological and natural philosophy ideas, natural philosophy being what science was called at the time. Indeed, many people in these circles of the religious inclination were talking about these ideas, about new things that are being discovered in terms of scientific endeavour. These were not off the table cardinal sins. This was not heresy to be able to say, you know what, have we considered the fact that this passage in Joshua might not quite be literal and might be talking about something else? For clarity, about 8 years before Urban did become the Pope, Galileo had been given a little bit of a warning by the Inquisition to stop overstating some of his Copernican ideas around how they impacted theology. And Galileo was like, you know what, fair enough, I will stop doing that. And for 8 years, he kept absolutely stum, not responding to critics and not pushing the case any further. He was an incredibly devout Catholic. So when Urban came to power, he went to Urban and he said, can I write these ideas down in a book now? Can I really get them out there? We're friends. You think I'm great. Can I do this? And Urban was like, yeah, go ahead. But don't go ahead and start saying things that we can't endorse, like this is the new theology. This is the new way we think about things. This is how this impacts scripture. And Galileo was like, yeah, absolutely not. So Galileo thought, how do I write this book in such a way that it is in line with what the Pope and the Church are asking me to do? So he presented it as a dialogue between the existing Aristotelian view and the other view that he was presenting, which was this update on heliocentrism and Copernican thought. And so Galileo went ahead and wrote the book, and he presented a first edition, and it was generally approved by the Catholic Church. Although they said, you know what, we want to look at it one more time, just want to check before we publish it in Rome that this is exactly what we do approve of. And because Galileo was getting on a bit and he really wanted these ideas not to die with him, he sort of pushed the process a little bit and rushed it through. And eventually there was kind of a second review, but it was done just by a Dominican monk who apparently was so moved to tears by the deference of Galileo in the text to the Catholic Church and to the faith that he said that we should be begging you to publish this work. But here's where the problem really began. You see, Galileo took the words of the Pope and put them in the character of the book called Simplicio. You see. And Pope Urban, although he was Galileo's friend, was quite upset about this. And so Galileo was brought again before the Inquisition. And you think, oh, this is where the story begins. This is where they torture him and they execute him. No, Galileo was actually given pretty much just like a slap on the wrist and an out-of-court settlement and told, stop doing that. And Galileo was like, yeah, I'll stop doing that. I've gone a bit too far there, I understand. But the problem with that was that Pope Urban didn't feel like that quite justified the level of embarrassment that he'd felt. So he was threatened with torture, but he was never actually tortured. This was quite standard procedure of the era. We don't think of torture in the 17th century the way that we think about it now. It's pretty commonplace back then. And at the end of this process, without going into all of the detail, he was put in house arrest for the rest of his life. Now, he was quite an old man. He was already worried about this, hence publishing the book at a much quicker rate than he was asked to. But also the house that he spent the rest of his life in was a Medician villa. Not exactly the worst punishment in the world. And also beyond this, he wasn't trapped there in isolation. You know, he wasn't like Napoleon trapped on an island. He was able to write and share more ideas. And in fact, most of his most famous and influential texts were written during this period. He had lots of time to do it. So was this a story about the pursuit of reason and science over the dogmatic view of faith and all these imbecilian men of the clergy? Well, no. In fact, the Catholic Church were probably the pioneers of science in this era. In fact, Copernicus himself was a member of the clergy, and Galileo was an incredibly devout person. And Newton, who I've already discussed in other videos who followed, was also an incredibly devout person. These people were not naive, ignorant men or thinkers. They were giants intellectually, and they were having these discourses and conversations about all these ideas. In fact, one of the reasons why Galileo's theory wasn't taken up by the church at the time was because there were lots of other explanations on the table. Galileo hadn't cracked it. He hadn't figured out the entirety of heliocentrism. He hadn't answered all the questions that were there, but he believed that he really needed to get this opinion out there, and in doing so, offended the Pope. That was his crime. That's why he was in house arrest. So why do we believe the things that we understand about Galileo's life? Well, I've already mentioned in a previous video about the pamphlets of Draper and White and how those anti-dogma publications ended up being the discourse around which we think of science and reason and faith even to this day. And in one of those pamphlets, there was this quote. And so this quote here speaks about how Galileo was persecuted by the church. But because of the influence of Draper's pamphlet, we now think that this is the true story. You can go back and read all the documents about Galileo, and there's an amazing video here that you should go and watch that goes into much more detail. So I'm not just telling you these things and you need to believe them because I'm saying them. That would be ironic. I want you to go away and do your own research if you don't believe me. So this is why we think that Galileo might be a martyr, and why science and religion have always been at odds, and it's always been this perennial struggle. Not true. But what's even more astounding and important about Galileo's life that still resonates to this day is in fact another idea. When he was trying to create the dialogue between different ideas, ones that didn't impinge on the way that the church analysed scripture or made theological statements, he split the world into two aspects: the qualitative, the soul, the sort of experience, the aspect of being, and the quantitative, the science, the numbers, the descriptions, the empirical evidence. And he split science out like that so that he didn't create that dissonance and that disagreement between the church and the pursuit of these types of ideas. And unfortunately, that has created a huge trap for us to this very day. This means that ever since the 17th century, we have considered a science as separate from the world of experience, the world of being, the world of consciousness. And so that makes our science flat and cold and lacks that extra dimension that we know is real, we know is true, we're doing it right now, we're experiencing. And it also means that the arena of experience and consciousness and soul and faith and spirituality also feels kind of unrigorous at times, because it doesn't need to concern itself with that bit over there, because historically it was kind of split. Because at that point, moving into that Newton era, remember, Galileo died the year that Newton was born. This is what we were left with. This was the remnants of that. And so in my future videos, I'm going to discuss how we can build that bridge again back between science, reason, empiricism, and faith and spirituality and all of these concepts. So join me in the next few videos where we're in fact going to discuss some of the modern scientific conceits that actually allow us to be a bit more spiritual and to be more hopeful about the fact that this world and this life isn't a dissonance between religion and faith and science. In fact, there is harmony between the two.